Thank you for being with us tonight. As we go into our Navi class, we're in Perek chapter 8 of Shmuel Bet, 2 Samuel, around Pasuk verse 15. And I hope you'll be with us every week and visit my YouTube channel. That's Rabbi Rav Fischer. Thank you. We left off learning in great detail that David HaMelech, King David, has decided to prepare everything for King Solomon, his son who is not yet born, to build the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. God has told him he will not merit building the temple for reasons we learned in previous weeks, but he will have a son who will be born and will build the temple. And David, rather than sitting back and saying, okay, I do my part, and my son will do, well, that'll be his project. David says, if I cannot build the temple, because that's God's will, he didn't say I can't gather the materials for the temple. He didn't say I can't hire people to get trained to learn how to build the temple. He didn't say I can't get an architect for the temple. He didn't say I could. And so David got everything ready for the temple, so that when his son would be born and grow up and be able to become king and be able to build the temple, he would not have to start from scratch. The wheel already would have been invented. And so David HaMelech, King David, we've been studying that. And he was down to the last part of, oh, by the way, he's got a lot more life ahead of him. This is just like a side point in his life. He's got a lot more years to go, and there's a lot more to study about him. He decides next to prepare for my son to be able to build the temple and not be obstructed. I'm going to make sure he has peace in his lifetime and that no neighboring country can bother him. So I'm going to go country by country and invade all the bordering enemy countries and make it that they'll never be able to make war for like the next generation or two. I will take care of that for him as well. Not only getting him gold, silver, yada, yada, but I'm going to stop the Moabites and the Edomites and all these neighboring countries that I've had to fight, that have been fighting with us forever. Number one, I have figured out that if you only fight them in defensive wars, no matter how much God blesses you, you'll have another war and another war and another war. And just think at what we're looking at with Hamas and Gaza. As long as Israel keeps fighting only defensive wars, warding them off when they attack Israel, never get anywhere. It just puts it back for another 3 to 5 years. So David says, this time I'm going to invade their countries and I'm going to take care of them for once and for all. Not genocide. I'm not going to exterminate the Moabites and the Edomites, but I'm going to put them in such a state they will not be able to make war for the next generation or two. My son Shlomo will have no problems with them ever. It's really what's happening right now in Gaza with Hamas. Netanyahu made the mistake again and again and again of signing peace agreements. Each time he was on the brink of victory, and he, under pressure from America, from Obama, from this one, from that one, he would sign peace agreements, pull back everybody from Gaza, and let Qatar send like $83 billion worth of material and cash to Hamas on a theory that now that we've pulled back and there's peace and there's a real ceasefire, it's in writing. They signed a ceasefire. I've got a copy of it. It's in writing. Well, they'll take the $83 billion. They'll create a good country. They have a beautiful beach along the Mediterranean Sea, and we'll have Shalom al Yisrael. We'll have peace in Israel. And each and every time, like Lucy with the football with Charlie Brown, the same thing again and again and again. They would take the money and they would take everything they import. They would import concrete and steel, saying that they're going to use it to rebuild the buildings that Israel had knocked out. And we now know what they did with all the concrete and steel. They built an underground tunnel system that, I'm not exaggerating, it's been compared to the New York City subway system. Literally, like every street, the entire it's like 2 countries. There's Gaza up. It's like what? Upper Mongolia, no, it's inner Mongolia and outer Mongolia. It's Upper Gaza and Lower Gaza. And you know what's going on now. And only now did Netanyahu finally reach the point towards the end of his political and public career, did he finally figure out it's never going to end. And he's going to be handing this over to the next generation unless for once and for all, they go in, they invade, they go all the way in, they go through Khan Yunis, they go to Rafiah, they go to the Philadelphia corridor, and they just wipe that thing out. Again, not genocide. If they wanted to do genocide, there would be no Gaza today. Absolutely no Gaza. It's just the opposite. They have lost soldiers of IDF Tzava because they're so careful not to harm people who are not their targets. But anyway, what we're learning now is instructive, not only as biblical history, but it gives you the insight into exactly what's going on right now. Let's take a look at where we left off as we continue. And this is all part of all things. This is part of his plan to build the Beit HaMikdash. Let's just get that poem, okay? He can't build the Beit HaMikdash himself, so he is going to build it for his son by killing them all out. And this I'll be covering later on. I didn't mean that for that now, but that's what it is. That's what it is. It's exactly what it is. All right, we'll have to edit that out later. Okay, here we go. I want to begin with a song. We've played this song in the past. It's the song that God will rebuild the temple, and the city of Jerusalem shall be rebuilt again in all of its glory. And we'll continue from there. Shlomo Carlebach. Yiboneh means he will build a mikdash, the temple. Ir means city. Tzion, Zion, Timale will be filled. Yiboneh HaMikdash, Ir Tzion Tamale. Visham, there, Nashir, we will sing Shir Chadash, the new song. Uvernana, and with great musical joy, Na'aleh, we shall rise up. He will rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. The city of Jerusalem shall be complete. It remains incomplete until it is rebuilt. And we'll all go up there singing. Okay. All right, I'll drop that out. Let's just take that out. And let's start learning. Here we go. Oh, okay. This is the one I wanted also.
בשנה שיר שיר חדש ציון ציון בנה המקדש ציון ציון אוי בשנה שיר שיר חדש ובנעלה לשנה שיר שיר חדש ובינם let's go
The words let's go. The words let's go. Okay, and now, as the man said, let's go. Last week, so our last class, he wiped out the threat of Moav, the Moabites. And we learned more about why, in particular, he went after Moav. Again, at that time, there was only one country, not a divided country, which happens later. He was king over all of this. And Moav was across the Jordan River is here. And this is the Yam Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And then here is the Salt Sea, Yam HaMelech. And Melach is salt, Melech is king. Also, it's got a different letter in it. So he starts with Moav. And we learned he had a matter that he had to resolve anyway with Moav. So let's continue with, we learned it last week, but this week I'll read it to you from within the Midrash. So in Bamidbar Rabbah, where they're talking about other things, there's a side discussion about what happened in Moav. It will refresh your memory and take us on to the next part. Rav Fischer, b'sha'ah shebarach David mipnei Shaul, back in the time when Saul was the king and David was running for his life, holich aviv imo el melech Moav. David brought his father, Aviv, and mother, Imo, to the king of Moav. We learned this in a different commentary. This is the commentary that's the source of the other commentaries. This Midrash. Ki haya yareb mipnei Shaul. David feared King Saul, was afraid what Saul would do to him. Consequently, David fled, and he left his parents and family with the king of Moab for safekeeping. And he had particular confidence. He had confidence in the Moabite. Now, why would David have confidence that the king of Moab would protect his parents, his family? Because Ruth, the famous Ruth of the book of Ruth, was a Moabitess, was from the people of Moab. That's the very famous discussion about that she converted to Judaism, having been non-Jewish. And there's a tremendous amount of discussion in the sources about the Torah said a Moabite cannot convert to Judaism. So how could she? And the rabbis explained that a Moabite male may not convert, but a female, a Moabitess, a Moaviyah, as opposed to a Moavi, may convert. So the famous Ruth HaMoaviyah came from Moab. Wait a second, did Ruth come first or did David come first? Well, obviously Ruth came first. Ruth is the progenitor of David. After a few generations from Ruth and Boaz came David. So this is not just a Bible story to him. This is like his great-grandmother. And he can trust the people. That's where she comes from. Of course, there's two ways to look at it, and I'm not saying this to be funny. But I mean, would I have trusted my family to the Tsar of Russia and the heads of Poland on the theory that my grandmother and my grandparents came from Russia and Poland? I got to tell you, I'm a sentimental guy, you know that. And I've gone back to where I grew up in Brooklyn. I once brought Ellen Zichrona Livracha with me on a Sunday. We had to go to New York for a wedding, and we left about 4 hours earlier than we were going to, so I could drive her to where I come from in Brooklyn, and we could see the whole neighborhood. All those shuls that I grew up in now are churches. That's something sentimental. But I'll go back to Brooklyn, Poland and Russia to see my roots. Keep your roots. So the thing is, that's the other side of it, as I'm learning with you, that Midrash, that's kind of interesting. Nevertheless, he felt she came from Moab, only across the water, and Saul is going to kill us. So let's take a chance. So, as they're explaining, he left his family with Moav. Hadahu dechtiv, vayelech David misham mitzpeh Moav. As it says in 1 Samuel chapter 22, as David fled from Saul, he departed from Moav. Vayomer el melech Moav, yetzana avi ve'imi, itchem ad asher eda mayaseli Elokim. And David said to the king, I'm leaving my parents with you. I'm running until things kind of clarify. As you know, I'm under hot pursuit by Saul. And when things clarify and I find out what God intends for me, is it God going to have Saul capture me, kill me? Am I going to get out of this thing okay? Will I be safe? As soon as things settle down, I'll come back and pick up my family, okay? The Omer, Vayanchem et Penei Melech Moav, Vayeshvu imo kol yemei heyot David b'mtzudah. And so, as the text says, so he led them to the king of Moav, and they stayed with him as long as David remained in Mitzudah, the stronghold of David. Okay. What happened? Let's skip that sentence. It's comparing Moav to a pot of meat. And he found out that when he comes back, they've been destroyed, his family. Shaharaga melech Moav v'lo nimlat mehem ele ach echad leDavid. That the king of Moab went on to murder the entire family of David, except for one brother who managed to get out. Shebarach etzel Nachash melech bnei Ammon. His one brother, the only survivor of the entire Davidic family, went to the next country over, Ammon. Where's Ammon? Here's Moav. Here's Ammon. So he fled for his life across the border. Couldn't get this a ways because Saul is trying to wipe out David and whatever. So he went that a ways. And he goes up there to try to survive. And the king of Ammon was named Nachash, which actually translates to snake. And he was, we know from other things. But in this way, V'shalach melech Moav acharav v'lo ratzah litno. The king of Moab sent a messenger to the king of Ammon, to Nachash, said, do you have any members of the David family there? I'm asking you in the spirit of comity to send them back. Our two countries are relatively at peace, just like any two Arab countries or Muslim countries like, Iraq and Iran. And I'd like you to we'd like to have them back. V'hu hachesed she'asa Nachash im David, and this is the kindness that King Nachash, an evil snake of a guy, nevertheless, the kindness that he did for David from his throne in Ammon, telling the king of Moab, I don't have anybody. And that's why David started with wiping out the Moabite military and a good chunk of its population, if you recall. That David, in defeating Moav, had all the men of Moab lie down prostrate for miles and measured that distance, and at an arbitrary cutoff 2/3 the way through, all those in the first 2/3 of the measurement were executed, and the remaining third were left alive. And he measured off two, they say rope or cable sizes, those are pretty big cables, to kill 2/3 of the male population, and the remaining third of the male population he left alive. And he kept those 1/3 as subservient under Israel. And then next came Edom. The Edomites, where are they in the greater frame of things? Here's Edom. So he's in Moav. His brother went up here to Ammon. He, in his march, David, now marches south to Edom. Edom are going to be later the progenitors of, keep in mind, Edom are the descendants of Esav. who was also known as Edom, the twin brother of our third patriarch Yaakov. When Yitzchak and Rivka finally were blessed with children, Rivka had twins, and Yaakov came out righteous, and Edom came out not as righteous. All kinds of issues about how Esav ultimately came out, but those were the Edomites. And so he wiped them out. And then we learned also in the text, and now, which will bring us back to our next part of the commentary. So, first of all, after he's done, we had read that he'd killed out Hadadezer, the Amalekites he killed out, Sova, and then Vayasam Edom Nitzivim, Bechol Edom Sham Nitzivim. He set up military forts and garrisons. Vayichol Edom Avadim LeDavid, and he made all of the Edomites likewise his servants. Now, when we were learning about all these different people whom he destroyed in the course of preparing the land of Israel to be at peace during the era of Shlomo, we learned something additional, if you remember, from a week or two ago, and I just wanted to bring this out to you also. We learned that Vayelko David Mimenu, let's see, we're on chapter 8, verse 4. Vayelko David Mimenu Elef Ushva Me'ot Parashim. When David went to war against Hadadezer of Sova, he captured from him 1,700 horsemen. That's military. That's not equestrians preparing for the Olympics or for the Kentucky Derby. Those are the chariot fighters who fight. Like if you think of those wars, those old 1950s movies, Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, how they would fight in chariots. And you had to be able to direct 4 horses or 6 horses while you're standing in that thing and you're using your whip it's quite a bit of prowess. So he collected 1,700 of them, he captured, the Esrim Elef Ish Ragli, and 20,000 foot soldiers. Vayakir David et kol ha'rechev, and David castrated, he sterilized all the horses that were taken. Vayoter mimenu me'at rechev, and they destroyed everything except for 100 that he kept. And here's a commentary. What's the deal with sterilizing the horses? I wanted to share this with you. We did not have time last week, and it gives you an insight into several things. Number one, the Torah tells us in Devarim, Perek Yud Zayin, chapter 17, that the day will come, God, of course, through Moses is telling the Jews in the desert of Sinai, you're getting closer and closer, approaching the land of Israel. Joshua will take them across. And there will come a time, not immediately, but there will come a time when you will say, we would like to appoint a king over us. As we know, with the benefit of history, we know looking back that for quite a time, generation, they had judges, shoftim, people like Gidon, Yiftach, Shimshon, Samson, Devorah, Deborah. They had major Ehud, and they had major judges who acted both as quasi-kings and quasi-upholders of the law. But eventually they reached the point, and then they went to Naviim, where at the end of the age of the judges came the age of the prophets, beginning sort of with Samuel, Shmuel. And then towards the end of the career of Shmuel, he died at 52, according to most commentators. Some say he lived a lot longer than that. And before he died, his sons, who might have been his successors, there are various reasons that they did not rise in the people's eyes to be the followers. And we learned a lot more about that in its time. And so with the end of Shmuel's career and no new prophet on the horizon, The people asked for a king. And in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 17, when the people will say, we would like a king, and you will decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. Asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. God says, Som tasim alechem melech. Go ahead and appoint a king. And that's how we ended up with Saul and David, etc., etc. Asher yivchar Hashem elokecha bo. But you don't just pick a king whom you want. It's not like an American election. You see how those work. It's amazing. 300 million people in this country, and it comes down to the two that we have. And what happened to the other 299,999,998? A lot of them don't, some of the best people don't want to be president because their whole lives become schmutzed by the media and it's a shame. That's the problem. I'm in favor of democracy. Don't take this out of context, but that's the problem with democracy. You don't necessarily get the best. With a monarchy, it's interesting. You get the best, like David and Shlomo, but you also get the worst, like Menashe and Yeravam ben Nevat. So that's also a problem. Menashe, as we've learned, 55 years of being a king, he destroyed everything and brought about the destruction of Israel with the fall of Yehuda and Babylonia coming in. So all the systems are no good. It's like the guy who explains to another guy the difference between communism and capitalism. So this communist is in a discussion with another guy. He says, can you please explain to me what's the difference? He says, the difference is night and day, 180% different, 180-degree difference. In capitalism, man persecutes man. And in communism, it's the other way around. And so that's it. Until human beings are great, that's how it is. So we continue. So you'll have a king. The only thing is, when you have a king, there are several. First of all, he's got to be chosen by God. So the prophet Samuel was sent to anoint Shaul and later to anoint David. And there are going to be rules. He has to be a member of the tribe. You can't have someone who is born non-Jewish become king. And here's the key here. Rak lo yarbelo susim. He may not have a multiplicity of horses. May not have too many horses. Malbim explains, Mima shekatuv lo yarbelo, hainu la'atzmo. First of all, Malbim says, you'll notice, it's not that the text says he cannot bring in too many horses into the people of Israel for the people of Israel to have. There's not a ban on too many horses in Israel, but the word lo, for him, he may not bring in too many horses for himself, la'atzmo. Shehem susim b'telim, because there's no purpose to that, other than acquiring glory, honor, and showing off, look at all the horses I have, like people who show off how many expensive antique cars they have in their garage. King of Israel is not allowed to have too many horses. She'en bahem tzorach, horses for which there's no purpose other than just to have the garage full of horses. Obviously, I mean, not a garage, stable, whatever. Aval susim hatzrichim l'rachavei hamelech. But in terms of horses that the king would need for his chariots, for a shav, and for his fighters on chariots, shehem letzorach hamilchama sheyalahem, for the purpose of war that they're going to have. Well, for that, he's allowed to have a lot of horses. Okay, so file that in your mind, that there's a limit on how many horses the king is allowed to have. Again, alzeh ayin zayin alzeh ein musar. To have a lot of horses for the purposes of conducting war, that's not a concern. That's not what God is warning him. Rak al sus batel mushar. He's only warned not to have unnecessary horses. By the way, v'over afasus echad. Even one horse too many is a violation of this Torah law. Okay. And separately in Rambam, in Hilchot Melachim Umilchamot, in the laws of kings and wars in the Rambam Mishnah Torah, Just so happens we're about to be learning this on Thursday class. We're taught that when we go to war and defeat the enemy, we are not allowed to destroy trees wantonly, particularly fruit trees. And you possibly have heard of this, that it's a Jewish thing in our culture and religion that you're not allowed to cut down a fruit tree unless there's a substantial reason, and we can learn that more in the Thursday class. But you're not allowed to destroy kol ilan srak mutar lakotzato va'afilu ein tzarich lo. You're allowed to destroy a tree that does not grow fruit, that is barren, non-fruit bearing. Even if you don't need to cut it down, you're allowed to cut it down. But when it comes to a fruit tree, you're not allowed except for certain things here. And we're going to not get into that, but we are going to get into this. Veloha ilonot bilvad. And not only are you not allowed to just go around cutting down trees, elakol hamishaber kelim. It's called bal tashchit, bal tashchis. I don't know whether you know it, but it's actually a Jewish law. You're not allowed to destroy things that don't have to be destroyed. It's a big, big thing. I remember in Yeshiva Katana in elementary school, when we were in elementary school, yeshiva, they made the point that kids would take pencils and break them, if you remember what pencils were. And kids would take pencils, and the Rebbes would teach you, you're not allowed to break a pencil. That's bal tashchit. You don't want the pencil anymore, throw it away, put it away. But don't just go around breaking things. You're not allowed to break things. Not allowed to break a dish, not allowed to break bal tashchit. You're just not allowed to just tear up paper at random. If there's a reason you're making a point, but otherwise you're not allowed to destroy things. Very important concept, and I want to bring it to your attention because it's going to come into play right here. So you're not allowed to destroy. How far does that go? Kol hamishaber kelim, you're not allowed to destroy utensil. Again, if the utensil no longer is usable, you can throw it away. But just randomly to destroy it, let's say you want to show how rich you are. This set of silver, and you take two pliers and start breaking silver forks just to show, it's nothing. You're not allowed to destroy utensils. The koreh begadim, you're not allowed to tear up clothing, that, give it to some kind of charity, that a gemach, some kind of a charity that provides clothing for those who don't have it. And if you don't know any Jewish place in your region, give it to a church and let people have clothing, for goodness sakes. The Horeis Binyan, you're not allowed to just go around destroying buildings just to destroy buildings. You're allowed to destroy a building if you're going to be building something else instead. But, there are people that go around breaking windows and things like that. V'soten mayan, not allowed to plug up let's say a well just because you're a rotten person. Uma'abed ma'chalot derech hashchata, just throw away food for no reason. If it's expired and you have to throw it away, you throw it away. But just to go around throwing things away, over below tashchit. It's a violation of the halacha, lo tashchit, or the way we pronounced it in Ashkenazic Hebrew, bal tashchis. Okay, with that as background, the Radak discusses how he sterilized all those horses. Here they took 1,700 horsemen and all their horses via aker, and he sterilized them. And of course, these were male horses because they're horses at war. They're not female horses. Via aker David, and David sterilized them. Lefi shehu asur lo laharbot sus. So if he didn't want them, if he simply captured the horses in order to prevent Hadad Ezer and Sova from having those horses, so that to put their cavalry out of business, so that in the generation of his son Solomon, they no longer would have an operational cavalry because all their military horses would be gone. If that was his purpose, while he's busy killing all of those soldiers, why didn't he kill the horses? He's not allowed to. On the one hand, asur lo laharbot sus. On the one hand, he's not allowed to take those horses and add them to his stable. From what we just learned a few seconds ago, that the king is commanded not to have more susim, more horses than he needs for military purposes. And he didn't need any more. So on the one hand, he can't keep them. As we just learned, it says he's not allowed to have any horses. Velo hemitam. And on the other hand, he didn't kill them. He asur lahashchit davar. You're not allowed, davar nivra. You're not allowed to destroy, as we just learned in the Rambam, al tashchit. You're not allowed to destroy something that has been created. Derech hashchata, simply to destroy it. Imlo haya mezik. If it wasn't doing damage. Now, look, if you have 1,000 horses that you conquered, and now these horses are trampling your fields and they're trampling people, you would be allowed to kill them because it's purposeful. But just to kill them because we don't really need them, we took them only to get them away from Hadadezer, that doesn't work. So what do? So he had them sterilized. And in that way, he was able to keep them around, did not take them for his own possession, did not kill them, and they could be kept around for purposes, but they wouldn't ever again be able to be military horses. And so it's different from, let's say, the Amalekites, Shnemarbo Mishor Atse Migamal Viat Chamor. In the case of the Amalekites, for example, when Samuel told King Saul, Shaul HaMelech, to go and to eradicate Amalek, he told them also to eradicate all their animals. And that was by God's command. So that was different. But here, Akra Kadesh Lo Yikhu Mehem Anshe Hachayo. Here, the sterilizing simply was so that soldiers never again would be able to use those particular horses. V'ha'ikur utar b'susei ho'evim kadesh lo yilchamu bahem od liYisrael. And you're allowed to castrate, sterilize horses of our enemies so that they never again can be used in war against the Jews, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we continue with the text now. And David then became, with everything we've been learning as we finish the chapter, David became the king over Israel, Vayimloch, from the word melech, on all of Israel, and furthermore was Osem Mishpat, did justice, he sat as a judge, as the chief judge, as if of the Supreme Court, Shofet. He handed down judgment, Utzdaka, and righteousness, Tzedek, to the entire nation. This is a side of David, of King David, David HaMelech, that most people don't know about. People call him King David. They don't call him Justice David, the Honorable Judge David. But he was the Chief Justice, and he upheld the law. And when disputes could not be decided on lower courts and lower levels, it came before David. Abarbanel, we've talked about him in the past. He was a great rabbi in the time of Spain. He also was, talk about somebody with two hats. He was the greatest rabbi of his time in Spain, and he also was the Minister of Finance, personal treasurer to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. That Ferdinand and Isabella, who instituted the Inquisition and expelled the Jews in Tisha B'Av 1492. And Abarbanel, some pronounce his name Abravanel, because we only have the consonants in Hebrew and not the dots, the vowels. So some call him Abarbanel, some call him Abravanel. When the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, Isabella, in the decree, said all Jews are expelled from Spain except for Don Isaac Abarbanel. He stays. he was an elderly man, I don't know, 70s or 80s, very elderly. They wanted him to stay and continue as the Secretary of the Treasury, the finance minister. And famously, beyond famous, he said, I go with my people. And he gave away all the glory and honor that was his, that he had and could have continued having. And he trekked, an old man, they didn't have cars in those days. He trekked by foot with his people out of Spain. Beyond greatness. Hinenis Kar talks about that David became king of Israel. Hinenis Karkan, Hamachut David. Here it mentions, after telling us that David gathered all those supplies to build the Beit HaMikdash, and then David took care of the wars to make sure all the enemies of Israel on the boundaries no longer would be a problem. And then it suddenly says, and David was the king of Israel. He says the reason it says it right here, Shamayot David mishtadel b'milchamot v'lochem b'milchamot Hashem, that on the one hand, David was the military leader who was involved in the milchamot, v'lochem milchamot Hashem. He was involved in the wars, and he was fighting the battles of God. Milchamot Hashem. Shelo hayam ibn Zem mit Rachel me hamishpat v'hanhagat am Yisrael. But at the same time, that was not an excuse for him to step back an iota from overseeing justice in Israel and leading politically the nation of Israel. He wore all the hats at the same time as he was the general. Can you imagine, on the one hand, fighting in, I don't know, Gaza, leading the troops, and at the same time being the prime minister and overseeing what's going on there, and at the same time overseeing the courts? Even with all the wars in which he was engaged in fighting, he also actively was king over Israel, using modern day terminology again. Even as he's the chief of staff, well, not the chief of staff, but a primary overseeing defense minister, whatever you want to call it, he's also the prime minister. Reish Lamed Ratzalomar, Osa Avodat HaMalchut, all at the same time, doing the work of the Malchut, of the kingdom, the kingship, and doing Mishpat Tzedakah. What's the difference between justice and tzedek, justice? Mishpat, from the word shofet, is like courtroom justice. It's upholding the law. There are laws on the books, statutes, or precedents from prior cases and opinions, and applying them to new fact patterns. Tzedakah, well, you know when you give tzedakah, which is translated as charity because there's no real good English word for tzedakah. Tzedakah is more than voluntary charity. It's mandatory kindness. So he did all of that. And if someone comes, an example of tzedakah with King David, if a wealthy person and a poor person were in a litigation before David, as he was sitting in his capacity as the chief judge over a case, and they talk about it, if he was sitting and as he heard the facts, in his heart, I have no choice, I have to be honest. The super rich gazillionaire is right. And the poverty-stricken guy is wrong and owes the gazillionaire $30. And that gazillionaire doesn't need the $30 or $300 or $3,000. And the $3,000 is going to kill that poor guy. But I have to do mishpat. I have to do justice. So that's the mishpat. And then tzedakah. He would hand down a ruling. The poor guy has to pay $3,000. Obviously, they didn't have dollars as their currency. He's shekels, shekalim. The poor guy will have to pay $3,000 to the rich guy. Mishpat. And now tzedakah, we're going to take $3,000 out of the royal treasury, and we're going to give it to the poor guy to hand over to the rich guy so that everybody comes out even. Justice has been upheld, and at the same time, charity. That was King David. Mishpat and tzedakah. He did both. So we continue as we start winding down. So Abarvanel brings out that he was doing both at the same time. V'kiyem imken b'shleimut gadol shnei tachliot hamelech. And thereby he fulfilled at the same time the two forms of tachlis, the two priorities that devolve on a king. Asher amru Yisrael b'she'elotam. This is exactly what the Jews asked for in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 20. When they asked Shmuel, we want a king that we may be like all the other nations. Let our king rule over us and go out at our head and fight our battles. And so that's what they asked as their priorities. Someone who both will rule politically and be the fighter. And he fulfilled it. V'shaftanu malkeinu v'yatzal lefanenu v'nilcham et milchamotenu. And so finally, Ube'amro mishpat u'tzedakah, Abarvanel says, and when the text here says that he did both mishpat and tzedakah, justice and charity, for lack of a better word, ratzah sheyeh oseh mishpat u'tzedakah kafi adin. He wanted everything done properly according to the letter of the law. Exactly what I just explained, that while doing justice according to the letter of the law, he then, beyond that, executed acts of charity and kindness as per whatever was needed at the time. And so let's wrap up the chapter. There are 3 verses to go. It just wraps up the chapter. It wraps up almost this chart. Not only chapter 8, but this segment of the book of Shmuel Bet. He has prepared everything for Solomon, who is not yet born, someday to build the Beit HaMikdash. Everything is in place. The enemies have been vanquished. All the gold and silver, et cetera, have been gathered with the people who will be experts at making it. He is now back to being full-time king, military leader, and finally, it tells us, and he set up his cabinet. Literally, he set up his political cabinet. Yoav ben Tzruya al Tzava. We've learned about several times Yoav. Yoav, the son of Tzruya, you remember he's the one who killed, and it's sort of like an ambush. He's the one who killed the chief of staff for Ishbosheth of the house of Saul, Avner ben Ner, Abner. But on the other way, and he's the one that David on his deathbed will be telling Shlomo that there's a score to settle with Yoav. But through David's life, Yoav was his chief of staff and his defense minister and chief of staff at one. He needed him, and he was so strong, but was not able to deal with Yoav. And ironically, paradoxically, in our very own lifetime right now, we'll see what each day brings, but it's just ironic that Netanyahu, whatever you think of him as prime minister of Israel, he has his own defense minister named Yoav Gallant, and Gallant openly defies him every single day, holds press conferences every time Netanyahu announces some policy in a press conference. Gallant then holds a press conference and denounces Netanyahu's position. It could be on judicial reform. It could be on whether to hold on to the Philadelphia corridor. And people say, why doesn't he fire him? And he tried to fire him amid the fight over judicial reform, and it set off Netanyahu. Half the country is left-wing, half the country is right-wing, and it set like 100,000 left-wingers into Kaplan in Tel Aviv, demonstrating to take down the government if he doesn't reappoint Gallant. And he just didn't need the headache at the time, and he found it's more trouble to get rid of Gallant than to keep him there and have Gallant attack him every day. And now, as they're negotiating the hostage thing and the ceasefire, and Netanyahu has taken one position, and Gallant goes and holds press conferences saying he's all wrong. And there's no one else in the cabinet that does that. All the others in the cabinet stand. There was one leak that just came out. One of the other cabinet members also disagreed with Netanyahu, but it came up at the cabinet meeting, but outside the cabinet, they're all united except for Gallant. And people say, how could David not finally have just gotten rid of this guy? We see it in front of our eyes. Sometimes it's not so easy. So he had his cabinet. Yoav is in charge of the army. Yehoshaphat ben Achilud maskir. And Yoshaphat, you ever hear the expression, just maybe not, that was like a different generation, jumping Jehoshaphat? Jumping Jehoshaphat. So what's that about? There's a biblical name, Yehoshaphat. That's Jehoshaphat. There was also a king, Yehoshaphat. So anyway, he was, as maskir, he was actually the chief of staff. There's a chief of staff of the army. Let's say Lloyd Austin is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then there's the president, White House chief of staff. And so Yoshaphat ben Achilud was King David's chief of staff. Told him who's come to have an appointment, set up a schedule, helped him get his job done. And Vitzadok ben Achituv, Achimelech ben Evyatar Kohanim, in a Torah cabinet, you have to have a chief Kohen, a Kohen Gadol. You don't have a chief Kohen or a chief priest or a religious figure in the White House cabinet. But in a Torah cabinet, there's like the chief rabbi. In those days, the chief Kohen, the Kohen Gadol. So Tzadok was the chief rabbi, the chief Kohen, and Achimelech was his assistant. The Radak says, Sarei Kahuna, Ki hu mana Tzadok liot Kohen Gadol, that David appointed Tzadok, that's the first one mentioned, as his high Kohen, Mibnei Elazar. Remember, the original Kohen, we don't like to translate Kohen as priest. So we use the word Kohen, Kohen, as the English translation as well. The original Kohen was Aharon, the brother of Moshe, Aaron, the brother of Moses. So Aaron had 4 sons, Nadav and Avihu, who died tragically when they brought a unauthorized sacrifice or flame into the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert. And that left behind Elazar and Itamar. So Elazar was older than Itamar. And then from Elazar, he had a son, Pinchas, who becomes a major personality also. We're not talking here about Pinchas. So there was Elazar and Itamar. David selected Tzadok ben Achituv, Tzadok, the son of Elazar, the older of the 2 sons, remaining sons of Aaron, as the Kohen Gadol, umishnehu Achimelech ben Evyatar mibnei Itamar. And he appointed, to keep it balanced, the other surviving son of Aaron, Itamar. David named his son, Achimelech, to be the assistant, the Mishnehu, the assistant to the Kohen Gadol. Afal pi, Aleph Ayin Pei Yud, Afal pi shehaya Evyatar adayin chai. And Radak points out that Evyatar himself, that Evyatar was Achimelech ben Evyatar. Achimelech is the son of Evyatar, who's son of Itamar, even though from the Itamar line, even though Evyatar, the father, himself still was alive, because he cites, the Radak cites some later pasuk that indicates that. Nevertheless, okay. Kikasher Sidir David Roshei Avot Sidir Tzadok V'Achimelech, etc. So David now set up a cabinet that would sort of like get everything long term, and it would be like a little of a status imbalance to have Tzadok of the subsequent younger generation outranking, as Kohen Gadol, Evyatar, sort of his uncle. It just, David wanted to have a cabinet in place that would be appropriate subsequently. Usrayah Sofer, and he, in his cabinet, he had a sofer, a scribe. Nowadays, when we talk about a sofer, talking about someone who writes a Torah scroll or mezuzah clothim, mezuzah parchments. But a sofer, actually, like the word sefer means book, and a sofer writes a book. A sofer is someone who writes. Now, technically, kotev is to write. Sofer is more like inscribes. Thus, a sofer is a scribe. What does that mean? He's the one who kept the chronicles. He's the one who took the minutes. At a board meeting, a proper corporate board has someone taking the minutes. Then the next meeting, they begin the agenda, approving the previous minutes to make sure that the scribe got it right. And if everyone, after they discuss, I don't think it happened this way, I think it happened that way, et cetera, they vote and they pass the minutes. So for those that don't really know what that's all about, it seems very silly. For goodness sakes, we just spent 10 minutes, no pun intended, rare case of that, to pass minutes. What's this? Well, the reason the minutes are important is they save them forever, and they become part of the formal official history of the corporation. And in the same way, the sofer's job, especially in a time that there was no video and no other way to maintain things in the cloud, and that's how we know our history, by chronicling. And so that was an extraordinarily important role, to be the chronicler in the book of Esther, Megillat Esther. That's like a turning point in the entire story, is when Achashverosh could not fall asleep in chapter, I think, 5. And the first verses of chapter 5, Nodadosh not Hamelach. Achashverosh could not fall asleep. And so he asked that they should bring out the Sefer HaZichronot and start reading him from the chronicles of his kingship. And that's when they came across, there was once a time that someone wanted to assassinate you, but you were saved because Mordechai the Jew told the queen, and then he starts saying, so what did we ever do to thank Mordechai? And they say, we never thanked him. And one thing leads to another. You know the story. And if you don't, we'll go over it again next March. So God willing, Mashiach hasn't come first. So that's a very important role, to be the scribe. Finally, closing out the cabinet, Uvenayahu ben Yehoyada, v'hakreti v'hapleti, uvnei David kohanim hayu. And finally, his cabinet included Benayahu and the son of Yehoyada. So let's wrap it up with these little short commentaries. We, on the one hand, just went through the Radak on the two Kohens, and the last commentary for the day is Rashi. I'll make it easier. We'll pull them out in English for you, but we could also do them in Hebrew. Well, okay, it's a Targum Yonatan, it's Aramaic, so we'll make it easier for you in English. Benayahu, the son of Yehoyada. So Benayahu in the cabinet was in charge of the archers and the sling shooters. Nowadays, you have people in charge of the tanks, the launchers, the bombers. Someone's got the button for the nuclear or whatever. In those days, as we just saw like 2 weeks ago in the film, we saw Legend of Destruction. The way people fought in those days, and we know it whether in a serious or, for that matter, Monty Python. I mean, the way they fought in those days was what? With arrows and with slingshots. David, of course, famously so, with Goliath, but slingshots were like, instead of cannons and rifles, they weren't just like a kid shooting a slingshot. That's literally, they used those slingshots to kill people. And they used catapults that were a much more sophisticated version of slingshot, where you had the sling and you put a god-awful sized boulder, and then when you shot it, it could shoot this amazingly heavy boulder over the defending wall of a fortress. And the archers would sort of tip their arrows in fire and set fire to buildings. So these were, as you can see, as we look at the cabinet that he had, it was top heavy with fighters, with a defense minister, Yoav, a chief of staff with slingshot, and because that's the world. He didn't need a secretary of transportation or a secretary of education. He needed a secretary of slingshots and a secretary of arrows, and he needed a high Kohen, and he needed a chronicler. So I'll take a question in a second.